Have you ever had a neighbor who made you wish you lived on a deserted island? Now imagine that neighbor has the power to fine you, put a lien on your house, and basically ruin your life, all while smiling condescendingly at you over your own picket fence. That was my reality. My name is Alex, and for most of my life, my greatest ambition was to have a quiet home, a green lawn I could mow on Saturdays, and a life free of drama. I'm a logistics analyst, which is a fancy way of saying I spend my days staring at complex systems, finding inefficiencies, and designing smoother, more logical pathways for things to move from point A to point B. It's a job that requires patience, an obsessive attention to detail, and the ability to see how 100 small, seemingly unrelated pieces fit together to form a single, functioning machine. My wife, Sarah, calls it my superpower. I just thought of it as my job. That is, until Silas Croft, the self-appointed king of our homeowners association, decided to turn our quiet suburban dream into his personal fiefdom. The initial offense was laughably petty. A fine for our garbage cans being visible from the street 2 hours before the designated time. Then another for the unapproved shade of our welcome mat. Each notice was dripping with passive-aggressive language and signed with a flourish by Silas, president of the Oak Meadows HOA. But things took a dark turn when I questioned a sudden 50% hike in our quarterly dues at a public meeting. I had simply pointed out that the numbers in his proposed budget didn't add up, that the expenses for community landscaping had tripled with no visible change. The look Silas gave me wasn't just annoyed, it was venomous. That's when he escalated from petty tyrant to something far more dangerous. What he didn't know was that in trying to intimidate me, he wasn't just poking a bear. He was poking a man who dismantled complex, hostile systems for a living. And I was about to analyze his entire corrupt operation down to the last nut and bolt. Have you ever been pushed so far that you felt a switch flip inside you? A moment where you went from wanting peace to wanting justice, no matter the cost? This story is about that moment, and about the beautifully intricate plan that brought a bully's empire crashing down around him. I promise you, the ending is worth it. Silas thought sending a pair of leather-clad thugs to my door to scare my wife was a show of power. He had no idea it would be the first fatal move in a game he was already destined to lose. The moment it all changed began with a frantic phone call from Sarah. I was just wrapping up a conference call, charting out the shipping lanes for a new product line, when my phone buzzed with her picture. Her voice was a strained whisper, tight with a fear that instantly chilled my blood. "Alex, there are 2 men at the door. They don't look like they're selling anything. They're big. They have motorcycles." I told her to stay calm, not to open the door, and that I was leaving work immediately. The 15-minute drive home felt like an eternity, my mind racing through every terrible possibility. When I pulled into our driveway, I saw them. 2 hulking figures in faded denim and leather vests, leaning against the porch railing as if they owned it. Their bikes, ostentatious chrome beasts, were parked on the lawn, leaving deep ruts in the grass Sarah babbied every weekend. They saw my car and straightened up, their expressions a practiced blend of boredom and menace. I got out of the car, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I forced my face into a mask of calm neutrality. This wasn't a corporate negotiation, but the principles were the same. Control your own emotional state, and you control the room. Or in this case, the front yard. One of them, a man with a braided beard and a skull tattoo creeping up his neck, stepped forward. "You Alex?" he grunted. I nodded, my eyes flicking from him to the other man, to their bikes, to the front door where I knew Sarah was watching, terrified. "We got a message for you," the man continued, taking another step. "From the HOA. Mr. Croft says you've been asking a lot of questions, creating a lot of paperwork. He wants you to understand that this is a quiet community. He'd like to keep it that way. You understand." The threat was obvious, wrapped in the thinnest possible veil of civility. My first instinct was pure rage, but my second, the analyst's instinct, took over. This was a system, an action designed to produce a specific reaction: fear and submission. I just needed to introduce a variable they hadn't accounted for. I pulled out my phone. They smirked, probably thinking I was going to call the police. Let me see if I have this right, I said, my voice steady, my eyes on my screen. You must be Paul Reckitt Kowalski. The braided beard man's smirk vanished. And you, I said, looking at the other one, must be David Deuce Miller. David flinched, his eyes widening. I continued, my voice level and clear, each word a carefully placed domino. Paul, your parole officer is a Mr. Henderson, right? I imagine he'd be very interested to know you're engaging in contract intimidation, which is a clear violation of your terms. Especially since your priors are for assault and extortion. I swiped on my phone. And David, that's a beautiful bike. A 2019 Harley Street Glide. VIN number ending in 88B7. It's a shame about those aftermarket exhaust pipes, though. They exceed the state decibel limit by a good 20 points. That's a $500 fine and a mandatory impound for a second offense. Given your 2 prior noise violations last year, this would be your 3rd. I looked up from the phone and met their shocked gazes. And then there's the matter of who paid you. The payment of $1,000 was funneled through a company called Evergreen Community Solutions, LLC. It's a shell company. But its registered address is the same as the P.O. box for Silas Croft's private real estate firm. That little connection establishes a direct link for a conspiracy charge. For you, Paul, that's a guaranteed trip back inside. For you, David, that's a felony charge that will make owning that bike impossible. I paused, letting the information settle. The entire speech had taken less than 90 seconds. They stared at me, their tough guy personas completely shattered, replaced by raw panic. So here are your options, I said, putting my phone away. You can get on your legally modified bikes and disappear. You can go back to Silas and tell him whatever you want. Or you can stay here and we can wait for the 2 police cruisers that I dispatched via a silent alert app 5 minutes ago to arrive, and we can discuss your parole violations and conspiracy charges with them. Your choice. Paul looked at David, his face pale. The fight was gone, replaced by the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. They were thugs, not masterminds. They were tools, and they had just been informed in no uncertain terms that their user had set them up to take the fall. Paul turned back to me, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Hey man, no trouble. We're leaving. We didn't know David was already scrambling onto his bike. Just, can you call off the cops? Please. I gave him a long, cold stare. You have 3 minutes to be out of this neighborhood. After that, I can't guarantee anything. It didn't need to be told twice. Engines roared to life, and they tore out of my driveway, leaving behind nothing but ruined grass and the faint smell of gasoline. As they disappeared down the street, Sarah opened the door and ran to me, throwing her arms around me. She was trembling. How did you do that, Alex? Who were they? I held her tight, the adrenaline finally starting to wear off, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They were a message from Silas, I said, my voice low, and I just sent one back, but as I looked at the tire tracks gouged into our lawn, I knew this was far from over. Silas Croft had declared war. He just didn't realize his opponent's entire profession was the art of winning them. The immediate aftermath of the bikers' hasty retreat was a strange mix of relief and simmering rage. Sarah and I spent the evening going over it again and again, the adrenaline slowly giving way to a profound sense of violation. Our home, our sanctuary had been targeted, but my quick information-based counterattack had an unintended consequence. It empowered us. Sarah, who had been terrified, now looked at me with a newfound fire in her eyes. You completely dismantled them without even raising your voice, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. You used your work brain on them. She was right. For years, I had applied my analytical skills to inanimate systems of data and logistics. Now, I had pointed that lens at a human system of intimidation and found its critical failure points in minutes. The bikers, however, were just symptoms of the disease. Silas Croft was the source. Before they fled, the one I'd identified as Paul Kowalski had turned to me, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and a grudging respect. He set us up, man, he'd said, his voice dropping. Croft told us you were just some pencil pusher. Said to just lean on you a little, scare the wife. He paid us through a cutout, so it wouldn't trace back. He said it was foolproof. That little nugget of information was gold. It was a direct confirmation of intent. It wasn't just a threat. It was a premeditated criminal act. The next morning, I was expecting a call, an angry email, perhaps even a shamefaced Silas trying to deny everything. Instead, I got a certified letter taped to my front door. It was an official notice from the Oak Meadows HOA. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the HOA letterhead. It was a fine, a $5,000 fine for unauthorized landscaping alterations and damage to community property, citing the tire tracks on my own lawn. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. He was fining me for the damage his own hired thugs had caused. And at the bottom, in a scrawled, arrogant hand, was a personal note. Prompt payment is appreciated. Let's keep our community looking its best. This was his response. No retreat, no denied. Just a doubling down, a blatant act of aggression designed to show me that he was untouchable, that he controlled the board, the rules, and the reality of our neighborhood. He was using the very mechanisms of the HOA as a weapon. For him, this was a game of power, and he believed he held all the cards. That letter was the final push I needed. My frustration solidified into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This was no longer about exorbitant dues or petty violations. This was about a man who was willing to use threats, intimidation, and blatant fraud to maintain his grip on a small slice of suburban power. He had threatened my family and was now trying to extort me. The analyst in me took over completely. I went down to my home office, cleared my whiteboard, and at the top I wrote a single name, Silas Croft. This was now Project Takedown. I treated it like any other complex logistics problem. Silas's corrupt HOA wasn't a community organization. It was a hostile entity. I needed to map its structure, identify its key assets, understand its revenue streams, and find its vulnerabilities. My goal wasn't just to beat the fine or to get him to leave us alone. My goal was to dismantle his entire operation, to remove him from power so thoroughly that he could never harm another family in our neighborhood again. I started by pulling up the digital files I had already saved, the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC and RS, the bylaws, and the last 3 years of budgets that had been begrudgingly released to homeowners. I began cross-referencing everything. The budgets were a mess, full of vague line items and suspiciously round numbers. Landscaping, security patrols, administrative fees, the numbers were huge, but the services were mediocre at best. The landscaping was a crew of 2 guys with a rusty mower, and the security patrol was just one old car that drove through the neighborhood once a night. Where was all that money going? Silas had made a critical error, the same error every arrogant tyrant makes. He underestimated his opponent. He saw me as a pencil pusher, a quiet resident who could be cowed. He had no concept of what a man like me, a man who could trace a single shipment of microchips through a dozen countries and 3 corporate entities, could do with a set of his poorly falsified financial records. He thought he was sending me a message with that fine. He had no idea I had already read it, analyzed it, and was now tracing it back to its source with the full intention of burning that source to the ground. My home office, usually a sanctuary of organized thought for my day job, transformed into a veritable war room. I dedicated one entire wall to what I began calling the Silas chart. It started as a simple organization chart of the HOA board, with Silas at the top, a president for life by virtue of no one else wanting the thankless job. Below him were the other board members, a meek, retired librarian named Ms. Gable who served as secretary, and a gruff man named Henderson who was the treasurer and, from what I'd observed at meetings, a staunch Silas loyalist. My initial focus, however, was on the money. An HOA is a business, and businesses live and die by their cash flow. I started by cross-referencing the budget's expense reports with publicly available corporate records. The largest line item by far was Evergreen Community Solutions, LLC, the same company the bikers had mentioned. According to the HOA budget, Evergreen was paid a staggering $150,000 a year for landscaping, snow removal, and general maintenance. A quick search on the state Secretary of State website confirmed what I already knew. Evergreen was a shell. It was registered just 18 months prior, shortly after Silas had taken over as president. Its official address was a UPS store P.O. box in a town 30 miles away. There was no website, no phone number, no physical presence. It was a ghost corporation designed to receive money and nothing else. This was my first major thread. I printed out the corporate filing and pinned it to the board, drawing a thick red line from the HOA's budget directly to it. The second largest expense was a company called Secure Living Incorporated, which was paid $80,000 a year for the neighborhood's minimal security patrol. Another search revealed a similar story. Secure Living Incorporated was registered to the exact same UPS store P.O. box as Evergreen. A different name, a different filing number, but the same ghost-like footprint. I pinned its documents next to Evergreen's, and another red line went up on the board. A pattern was emerging. Silas wasn't just skimming off the top. He had created a complete, closed-loop system of fraud. He was using his unilateral authority as president to award no-bid contracts to sham companies that he, presumably, controlled. He was literally writing checks from the homeowner's funds to himself. The next step was to prove he controlled them. The corporate filings listed a registered agent for both LLCs, a legal requirement for any corporation. The name was a generic-sounding entity, Corporate Services of Delaware, a common tactic used to obscure ownership. This was a temporary roadblock, not a dead end. Digging deeper required more than just simple public searches. I used a subscription service I had for my work, which allows for more in-depth corporate and public records analysis. I ran the names of the LLCs, the registered agent, and Silas Croft himself through the database. For hours, I got nothing but dead ends and circular ownership structures designed to frustrate exactly this kind of inquiry. Then I had a thought. I stopped searching for Silas and started searching for his known associates. I remembered from a neighborhood barbecue last year that he had bragged about his cousin, a brilliant businessman, who had just moved to the area. I couldn't remember the cousin's name, but I did remember Silas mentioning he ran a small printing shop. A quick search of local printing businesses cross-referenced with property records brought me to a man named Martin Gable. Wait, Gable? The same last name as the board's secretary, the timid Ms. Gable. It could be a coincidence, but in my line of work, there are no coincidences until proven otherwise. I ran Martin Gable's name through the corporate database, and there it was, the jackpot. Martin Gable was listed as the sole signatory on the bank accounts for both Evergreen Community Solutions, LLC, and Secure Living Incorporated. But it got even better. I found a third company under his name, Croft Property Management. Its business address was Silas Croft's own home. This was the hub, the central processing unit of his entire corrupt scheme. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind I usually got when a complex logistics chain finally snapped into place on my screen. I now had the full picture. Silas used his power as HOA president to approve payments to Evergreen and Secure Living. The money went into bank accounts controlled by his cousin, Martin. Martin then likely funneled that money, minus his cut, back to Silas through the Croft Property Management Company, disguised as legitimate business income. And the quiet, unassuming Ms. Gable on the board? She was likely Martin's mother or an aunt. She wasn't just a meek secretary. She was a knowing or unknowing accomplice, providing the votes Silas needed to push his budgets through without question. I stepped back from a whiteboard, which was now covered in printed documents, red lines, and scribbled notes. It was a beautiful, terrible masterpiece of petty fraud. It was airtight, elegant in its simplicity, and utterly damning. Silas thought he was a king in his castle. He had no idea a logistics analyst had just drawn a complete schematic of his fortress walls, marked every weakness, and was now calmly planning the perfect way to bring them crumbling down. He was fighting a war on the battlefield of fines and intimidation. I was about to win it on the battlefield of data and public records. Mapping out the network of fraud was one thing. Proving it in a way that would not only dethrone Silas, but also put him in legal jeopardy was another. The whiteboard in my office looked like something out of a detective movie, a web of deceit connecting Silas, his cousin Martin Gable, the timid board secretary Ms. Gable, and the two ghost companies. I had the what and the how, but to make it stick, I needed the who, as in other people who could corroborate the pattern of abuse. A single disgruntled homeowner fighting back could be dismissed as a personal vendetta. A chorus of voices, however, becomes a movement. I started my search subtly. I spent the next Saturday walking my dog around the neighborhood, taking a longer route than usual. I wasn't just getting fresh air, I was conducting reconnaissance. I looked for the telltale signs of an HOA dispute. Neglected lawns that were usually pristine, unpainted fences on houses that were otherwise well-maintained, or even just a faint impression of a recently removed violation notice on a front door. My first stop was the home of an elderly woman, Mrs. DeLuca. I'd heard rumors that she was having trouble with the HOA. I found her in her front yard, staring forlornly at a beautiful, century-old oak tree that had a bright orange X spray-painted on its trunk. "Morning, Mrs. DeLuca," I started, keeping my tone gentle. "Everything all right?" Her eyes welled up with tears. "It's Silas," she whispered, as if the name itself was a curse. "He says the tree's roots might be interfering with the sewer line. He sent me a notice. I have to have it cut down in 30 days or face a $10,000 fine. This tree, my husband planted it the day our daughter was born. I asked if she'd gotten a second opinion from a plumber or an arborist. Silas said I have to use the HOA-approved arborist," she said, her voice trembling. "I called them. They want $5,000 to take it down. I had a strong suspicion I knew which LLC that approved arborist belonged to. I expressed my sympathy and told her not to do anything just yet, hinting that other residents were also having issues and that we might be able to help each other." She looked at me with a flicker of hope. My next conversation was with a young couple, the Harrisons, who were frantically repainting their garage door. They had been fined $2,000 because their original shade of beige was deemed inconsistent with the updated community palette, a palette no one had ever seen. The violation notice helpfully recommended a specific painter to ensure compliance. The painter's quote, of course, was astronomical. They were furious, but felt powerless. "It's cheaper to just paint it than to fight him and risk a lien on our house," Mr. Harrison said, his jaw tight with resentment. My most important discovery, however, came from a man named George Tanaka. George was a retired forensic accountant who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. I found him tending his perfect rose bushes. He was quiet, meticulous, and sharp as a tack. When I cautiously brought up the HOA, his eyes narrowed. "Croft," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "The man's a textbook embezzler. I tried to audit the books last year when I was on the finance committee. He stonewalled me at every turn, blocked my access, accused me of overstepping my authority. I finally gave up. It wasn't worth the headache. What if, I said, leaning closer, it was worth the headache now? What if I could show you exactly where the money is going?" I invited George back to my house. When he saw my whiteboard, his quiet demeanor evaporated. He stared at it for a full 5 minutes, his eyes tracing the red lines and connecting the dots. A slow smile spread across his face. "My God, son," he breathed, a newfound energy in his voice. "You've gift-wrapped him. This is beautiful. The shell companies, the cousin as a cutout, the family member on the board, it's all here." He then pointed to a detail I had overlooked. On the HOA's tax filings, the ones Silas had been forced to make public, there was a section for insurance. The HOA was paying a premium for a director's and officer's liability policy, or D&O insurance. This policy, George explained, his finger tapping the paper, protects the board from being sued for honest mistakes. But it has exclusions, and the number one exclusion is fraud. The moment you can prove intentional financial misconduct, the insurance is void. This was the kill shot. Silas operated under the assumption that even if he were caught, the D&O insurance would pay for his legal defense. He likely told his cronies the same thing, assuring them they were protected. By proving fraud, I wouldn't just be exposing him. I'd be yanking away his safety net and the safety nets of everyone who enabled him. The other board members, Henderson and Ms. Gable, might be loyal when they feel protected, but their loyalty would vanish the second they realized they were personally on the hook for Silas's crimes. With George as my financial expert and a growing list of victimized homeowners as my witnesses, my solo operation had just become a team. We weren't just a few angry residents anymore. We were an organized, evidence-based insurgency. The plan was beginning to form in my mind, not just a plan to expose Silas, but a comprehensive strategy to corner him, cut off his support, and ensure he couldn't just slither away. The next HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. Silas probably thought he'd be presiding over my public humiliation. He had no idea he was walking into a meticulously planned ambush. With George Tanaka's forensic accounting expertise and the growing list of aggrieved homeowners, my operation shifted from investigation to strategy formulation. We now had a small, dedicated team. There was me, the strategist and data miner; George, the numbers guru who could translate arcane financial documents into plain English; and Maria Harrison, the young wife who had been fined for her garage door, who became our communications lead, discreetly reaching out to other residents who had been targeted. We held our strategy meetings in my home office, the Silas chart and the whiteboard serving as our battlefield map. Our objective was clear: a complete and irreversible removal of Silas Croft and his cronies from power, followed by criminal prosecution. We couldn't just present our findings at the next meeting and hope for the best. Silas was a master manipulator. He would deny, deflect, and turn the meeting into a chaotic shouting match. We needed to control the narrative completely. Our plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, the paper trail. Phase 2, the alliance. Phase 3, the ambush. Phase 1 was already well underway. It was about creating an unimpeachable record of evidence. George and I spent days compiling what we call the dossier. It was a thick binder meticulously organized with tabbed sections. Section A contained the corporate filings for Evergreen Community Solutions and Secure Living Incorporated, highlighting the shared P.O. box. Section B detailed the connection to Martin Gable, with printouts of bank signature cards we managed to obtain through a friend of George's in the banking industry who owed him a favor. Section C was a complete flowchart of the money trail, showing the inflated payments from the HOA accounts flowing to the shell companies, and from there to Croft Property Management. George created a spreadsheet that compared the amount Silas was paying his own companies to the market rates for the same services. The difference was staggering. Over the past 2 years, he had funneled over $250,000 of our money into his own pockets. The final part of Phase 1 was to bait the trap. Following George's advice, I sent a formal, certified letter to the HOA board, officially disputing the $5,000 fine for the tire tracks. In the letter, I didn't make accusations. I simply quoted the specific sections of the HOA bylaws that require due process and evidence for any fine. I requested a copy of the incident report and any photographic evidence linking my property to the damage. I knew, of course, that none existed. This letter served 2 purposes. First, it painted me as a reasonable person following procedure. Second, it would force Silas to either ignore a formal legal request, which was a violation in itself, or to fabricate evidence, which was a felony. Either way, he was digging his own hole deeper. Phase 2, the alliance, was Maria's domain. She created a private email group and a secure chat for the dozen or so families who had been confirmed victims of Silas's extortion schemes. She collected sworn affidavits from each of them, detailing their stories. Mrs. DeLuca and her tree, the Harrisons and their garage door, a family fined for having a child's birthday party in their own backyard that was deemed an unauthorized public gathering. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, demonstrating a clear pattern of abuse of power for financial gain. The most critical part of this phase was securing the votes. To remove a president, our bylaws required a majority vote of homeowners at a specially convened meeting. We needed to ensure that when the time came, our people would be there, informed and ready. We also identified the other 2 board members as key targets. Mr. Henderson, the treasurer, was a gruff but seemingly pragmatic businessman. Ms. Gable was the wild card. Was she a willing participant or an oblivious pawn in her relative's scheme? George drafted 2 separate letters. The one for Henderson was a stark, professional warning, laying out the basics of the fraud and explaining in no uncertain terms that as treasurer, his signature on the checks made him personally liable and that the D&O insurance was void. The letter for Ms. Gable was gentler, suggesting she may have been misled by her family and offering her a chance to cooperate and do the right thing. These letters wouldn't be sent until the day of the meeting to prevent Silas from having time to coerce them. Phase 3, the ambush, was the culmination of everything. We would use the upcoming quarterly HOA meeting as our stage. Silas would be expecting to preside over a routine meeting, with my fine as a potential point of contention. He would feel confident, in control, and surrounded by what he believed were his loyal subjects. He would be completely unprepared for a coordinated, evidence-based assault on his entire operation. I booked the community center's projector and screen, telling the manager it was for a short presentation on neighborhood safety. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation that was the visual equivalent of our dossier, simple, clear, and devastating. Flowcharts, bank statements, photos of the victims' violation notices. It was a story of corruption told in black and white. The night before the meeting, our little team gathered one last time in my office. The dossier was complete. The affidavits were signed. The letters were sealed. The presentation was loaded onto a thumb drive. Looking at the faces of George and Maria, I saw the same mixture of anxiety and steely determination that I felt. We were no longer just victims. We were a disciplined unit on the verge of executing a carefully planned operation. Silas Croft thought he was a wolf, preying on a flock of sheep. He was about to find out that some of the sheep were lions in disguise. The execution phase began 48 hours before the HOA meeting. Every step was timed with the precision of a military operation. Our first move was to disseminate information strategically, creating ripples that would converge on Silas at the appointed time. I took the anonymous route first. I compiled a simplified version of our dossier, greatest hits of Silas's fraud, focusing on the shell companies and the voided D&O insurance. I mailed one copy to the state's Attorney General's office, specifically the division that handles nonprofit and community association fraud. I sent another copy to the local investigative reporter at the city's largest news station, a woman known for her tenacious reporting on municipal corruption. I didn't include our names, only a note saying, for your consideration, Oak Meadows HOA meeting, Thursday, 7 p.m. You may find it newsworthy. Finally, George, using his professional connections, sent a third package to a contact at the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division, highlighting the potential tax evasion and money laundering through Croft Property Management. This ensured that even if our internal HOA coup failed, a firestorm was coming for Silas from the outside. He was now on the radar of three powerful entities who loved nothing more than a juicy case of white-collar crime. The next step was activating our internal alliance. Maria sent out a carefully worded email to our group of affected homeowners. It was a call to arms, urging everyone to attend the meeting. It is crucial that we all show up, she wrote. We have a chance to make our voices heard and restore fairness to our community. Please be there to support your neighbors. There was no mention of a specific plan. We wanted the impact of the reveal to be genuine and shocking to the general audience. On the morning of the meeting, Phase 2's final move was executed. A courier delivered the sealed envelopes to the other two board members, Henderson and Ms. Gable. Inside, they found the letters George and I had prepared. Henderson received his stark warning about personal liability and the voided insurance, complete with a copy of the insurance policy's fraud exclusion clause. Ms. Gable received her gentler appeal, which included evidence of her relative Martin's involvement, urging her to protect herself by distancing herself from Silas's actions. This was a critical gamble. We were banking on Henderson's self-preservation instinct and Ms. Gable's potential innocence and fear. By the time Silas saw them that evening, they would have had the entire day to stew on the information, their loyalty hopefully eroded by the cold, hard reality of their legal exposure. The hours leading up to the 7 p.m. meeting were thick with tension. Sarah and I barely spoke, the unspoken anxiety hanging in the air. I went over my presentation a dozen times, making sure every slide was perfect, every piece of data cited. George called me an hour before we were due to leave. Just got a call from a friend who lives next door to Henderson, he said, his voice low. Henderson's been on his porch pacing for the last hour, making one angry phone call after another. I think our letter hit the mark. That was a good sign. It meant Henderson wasn't running to Silas. He was likely talking to his lawyer. When we arrived at the community center, the room was already more packed than any HOA meeting I'd ever seen. Our email blast had worked. Maria was near the door, greeting people with a calm smile, while George took a seat in the front row, looking like a placid retiree ready for a boring meeting. I saw Mrs. DeLuca, the Harrisons, and a dozen other families we had spoken to, their faces a mixture of nervousness and hope. Silas arrived a few minutes late, striding in with his usual air of unearned arrogance. He was carrying a gavel and a thin folder, a smug smile on his face. He clearly expected a confrontation over my fine and was ready to publicly shut me down. He nodded curtly at Henderson and Ms. Gable, who were already seated at the head table. I watched them closely. Henderson looked pale and refused to make eye contact with Silas. Ms. Gable looked like she was about to be physically ill, her hands trembling as she shuffled some papers. Silas didn't seem to notice, his ego blinding him to the storm clouds gathering right in front of him. He banged the gavel on the table, the sound echoing in the silent, expectant room. All right, let's get this quarterly meeting of the Oak Meadows Homeowners Association underway, he announced, his voice booming with false authority. We have a few items on the agenda. Starting with the treasurer's report, he looked at Henderson. Henderson swallowed hard, looked down at his papers, and then looked out at the crowd of homeowners. His eyes met mine for a brief second. The trap was set. The players were in position. The ambush was about to begin. The meeting began with an almost unbearable tension. Silas, oblivious, tried to proceed with his usual agenda, but the energy in the room was all wrong for him. The homeowners weren't shuffling papers or checking their phones. They were watching him, their eyes cold and focused. When Silas called for the treasurer's report, Henderson stood up slowly. He wasn't looking at his prepared notes. He was looking directly at Silas. Mr. President, Henderson began, his voice tight. Before I give the financial report, I believe there are some significant, unbudgeted financial liabilities that this board and this community need to be made aware of immediately. Silas's smile faltered. What are you talking about, Henderson? Stick to the agenda. I'm talking, Henderson said, his voice growing stronger, about the discovery of potential gross negligence and fraudulent activities that have legally voided our directors' and officers' insurance policy. I'm talking about the fact that every decision we have made could expose us, the board members, and potentially every homeowner in this room, to massive personal financial liability. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Silas's face was turning a blotchy red. That's an outrageous and unfounded accusation, he sputtered. Before he could continue, Ms. Gable, the timid secretary, suddenly found her voice. It was shaky, but clear. He's right, Silas, she said, wringing her hands. I received some information today about my nephew, Martin. I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't know about the companies. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes pleading. I'm officially resigning from the board. Effective immediately, the room erupted. Silas banged his gavel furiously. Order! Order! This is out of control. Ms. Gable, you will do no such thing. Henderson, sit down. But it was too late. His control was shattered. This was my cue. I stood up from my seat in the third row. Mr. Croft, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. Perhaps I can shed some light on the situation for everyone. All eyes turned to me. Silas's gaze was murderous. I knew you were behind this. You have no right to speak out of turn. You're not on the agenda. According to Section 4, Article C of the bylaws, I said calmly, projecting my voice so everyone could hear, any homeowner can move to add an item to the agenda for urgent community matters, and I believe a potential fraud of over $250,000 qualifies as urgent. I move to present evidence regarding the financial mismanagement of this HOA. All in favor? A deafening roar of aye filled the room. George, Maria, and dozens of others raised their hands. Silas was stunned into silence. He had lost control of the proceedings. I walked to the front of the room, thumb drive in hand, and connected my laptop to the projector. For the past several weeks, I began as the first slide lit up the screen behind Silas. Some of your neighbors and I have been looking into the HOA's finances. We were concerned about rising fees and a lack of transparency. What we found is deeply disturbing. The first slide was a simple organization chart. It showed the Oak Meadows HOA at the top. Below it, two boxes, Evergreen Community Solutions and Secure Living Incorporated arrows pointed from the HOA to these companies, labeled with the exact dollar amounts paid to them over the last 2 years, $150,000 and $80,000 annually. These two companies, I explained, receive nearly 70% of our total annual budget. Yet, they have no physical address, no website, and no employees listed in any public records. Their official address is a UPS store P.O. box. I clicked to the next slide. It was a screenshot of the corporate filings for both companies, with the shared P.O. box address highlighted in yellow. Curiously, I continued, my voice even and methodical. Both of these ghost companies list the same registered agent. The next slide showed the name Martin Gable, circled in red, listed as the signatory for both companies' bank accounts. I could hear Ms. Gable start to sob quietly at the head table. Silas was on his feet now, jabbing a finger at me. This is slander. It's illegally obtained information. You have no proof. All of this is public record, Silas. I replied without looking at him, keeping my focus on the audience. And as for proof, let's look at the money. The next slide was George's masterpiece, a detailed flowchart. It showed the money leaving the HOA account, going into the Evergreen and Secure Living accounts, and then a significant portion of it being transferred to a third company, Croft Property Management. And who owns Croft Property Management? I asked rhetorically. The next slide was the corporate filing for that company. At the bottom, listed as the sole proprietor, was a name everyone in the room knew, Silas Croft. The address listed was his own home address in our neighborhood. The room was silent for a moment, and then a wave of angry shouting erupted. People were on their feet, yelling at Silas, who stood frozen, his face a mask of pure, undiluted panic. He had walked into the meeting a king and was now being revealed as a common thief in front of his entire kingdom. I let the anger swell for a moment before raising my voice again. He hasn't just been stealing your money, I called out. He has been using your money to pay for intimidation and threats. Right on cue, the main doors to the community center swung open. Standing in the doorway, looking deeply uncomfortable, were Paul Kowalski and David Miller, the two bikers. And standing right behind them was the investigative reporter I had tipped off, her cameraman's light flicking on, bathing the chaotic scene in a bright, unforgiving glow. The arrival of the bikers and the news crew was the final, devastating blow in my carefully constructed ambush. The room, which had been simmering with anger, boiled over into chaos. Homeowners were pointing and shouting at Silas, whose face had gone from red rage to a pasty, sickly white. He looked from a projected screen showing his name on the fraudulent company to the bikers at the door, to the television camera now pointed directly at him. He was trapped, and the walls were closing in from every direction. The reporter, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, immediately zeroed in on me. "Are you the source that contacted our station?" she asked, her microphone held out. "I'm just a concerned homeowner," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The evidence speaks for itself. But perhaps you should ask Mr. Croft to explain why he used our HOA dues to hire these two gentlemen." I gestured toward Paul and David. The reporter and her cameraman pivoted to Silas. "Mr. Croft, can you comment on the allegations of fraud? Did you hire these men to intimidate residents?" Silas opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no sound came out. His bravado had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, cornered man. He looked at Henderson for help, but Henderson simply shook his head and slid his chair away from him, a clear act of abandonment. Ms. Gable was now openly weeping, being consoled by another woman from the audience. Paul Kowalski, the biker with the braided beard, stepped forward. He looked nervous under the camera light, but his voice was firm. "He hired us," he said, pointing a tattooed finger at Silas. "Silas Croft. He paid us $1,000 in cash to go to this man's house." He pointed at me, "and scare his wife. He said he'd take care of us if there was any trouble. He set us up. This confession, broadcast live to anyone watching, was the nail in the coffin. I clicked to the final slides of my presentation. One after another, the faces of the victimized homeowners appeared on the screen, next to a summary of their story. Mrs. DeLuca and her $10,000 tree. The Harrisons and their $2,000 beige paint. A dozen other families, a dozen other stories of petty extortion and financial abuse. This wasn't just about stealing money, I said, my voice resonating with cold anger. This was about using that money and his power to bully and harass his neighbors, to threaten elderly women and young families, all to feed his ego and his wallet. I turned to face Silas directly. You are a thief and a coward, Silas. You terrorize this community, and it ends tonight. At that moment, as if on cue, 2 uniformed police officers entered the community center. They had likely been called by a dozen different people in the room, or perhaps the news van parked outside had tipped them off. They surveyed the scene, and the reporter immediately intercepted them, pointing them towards Silas. The fight was completely gone from him. He sagged, defeated, as the officers approached him. He offered no resistance as they spoke to him in low tones, then gently but firmly turned him around and placed his hand behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was audible in the suddenly quiet room. It was a sound of finality, of justice, as they escorted a stunned and silent Silas Croft out of the building. Past the television camera and the shocked faces of his neighbors, a spontaneous cheer erupted in the room. It wasn't a cheer of vengeance, but of liberation. People were hugging each other, crying with relief. Mrs. DeLuca came up to me, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude. "You saved my tree," she said, squeezing my hand. George Tanaka clapped me on the back, a broad grin on his face. "Textbook exécution, son." Absolutely textbook. Maria and her husband came over to thank me, their faces glowing with relief. Henderson, the now ex-treasurer, approached me cautiously. "I had no idea it was this bad," he said, looking genuinely shaken. "I'll cooperate fully with the police. We need to fix this." The war was over. The tyrant had been deposed. We had taken back our community. The reporter was now interviewing other homeowners, getting their stories on camera. The narrative was set. A community rises up against a corrupt leader. As I looked around the room, at the faces of my neighbors united and empowered, I realized we had done more than just oust a bully. We had forged a real community, one that had been tested and had emerged stronger and more connected than ever before. The path ahead would involve untangling the financial mess Silas had left, electing a new, honest board, and rewriting the rules to ensure this could never happen again. But for the first time in a long time, the future of Oak Meadows looked bright. Sarah came to my side and wrapped her arm around my waist, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Logistics analyst? Ha," she whispered. "Looks like you just streamlined our entire neighborhood." I smiled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks finally lift. We had our quiet life back, and we had earned it. The downfall of Silas Croft was swift and total. His arrest at the meeting was only the beginning. The news story aired that night on the 10 o'clock news, complete with clips from my presentation, the biker's confession, and interviews with emotional homeowners. The next morning, our quiet suburban neighborhood was front-page news. The Attorney General's office and the IRS, having already received my anonymous packages, expedited their investigations. With the public evidence and the full cooperation of both Henderson and a remorseful Ms. Gable, the case against Silas was overwhelming. He was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, extortion, and witness tampering. His cousin, Martin, was also arrested and quickly turned state's evidence, detailing the entire money laundering scheme in exchange for a lighter sentence. Silas, stripped of his stolen funds and facing a mountain of evidence, had no choice but to plead guilty. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the Oak Meadows HOA, a sum totaling over $300,000. His house went into foreclosure to cover the legal fees and the initial restitution payments. The king had lost his castle and his crown, ending up in a place where his brand of petty tyranny would not be tolerated. In the weeks that followed, our community came together in a way I had never seen. We held a special election to form an interim board. George Tanaka, with his unimpeachable integrity and financial acumen, was unanimously elected as the new president. I was asked to serve as vice president, and Maria Harrison took on the role of secretary. Our first order of business was transparency. We hired an independent auditing firm to go through every transaction Silas had ever authorized. The final report was a sickening confirmation of his greed. We presented the full audit to the homeowners, holding nothing back. Then, we set about reforming our community from the ground up. I put my logistics brain to work, not on shipping lanes, but on bylaws. We drafted new rules that mandated competitive bidding for any contract over $500. We established an independent ethics committee. We made all financial records accessible to every homeowner through a secure online portal. We put term limits on board positions to prevent another president for life from ever taking power. The positive changes were almost immediate. With the fraudulent contracts canceled, our budget suddenly had a massive surplus. We were able to lower HOA dues by 20% while simultaneously investing in real community improvements. We repaved the roads, upgraded the playground, and planted new trees. Mrs. DeLuca's magnificent oak was not only saved, but was also adorned with a small, tasteful plaque that read, "The Oak of Oak Meadows." A symbol of community resilience. The fear and suspicion that Silas had cultivated were replaced by a sense of shared ownership and pride. Neighbors started talking to each other again at block parties we organized. The atmosphere changed from one of oppressive rule following to one of collaborative living. We had gone from a fiefdom to a functioning democracy. For me, the experience was transformative. I had always seen my skills as something I applied to my job, a tool for corporate efficiency. But this ordeal taught me that the ability to analyze complex systems, to find hidden levers of power, and to use information strategically could be a powerful force for justice. It taught me that standing up to a bully doesn't always require shouting louder or using bigger fists. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is a well-organized spreadsheet. The lesson in all of this is that systems of power, especially those built on arrogance and deceit, often look far more formidable from the outside than they actually are. Bullies like Silas Croft thrive on the assumption that people will be too intimidated, too busy, or too disorganized to fight back. They count on our silence. But when people come together, share information, and apply their unique skills to a common problem, even the most entrenched tyrant can be brought down. The world is full of petty tyrants, in HOAs, in workplaces, in all walks of life. They build their little empires on the belief that they are untouchable. But they all have weaknesses, they all leave a trail, and they all underestimate the quiet, methodical person in the third row who is taking notes. So, my final question to you is this. Who is the Silas Croft in your life? And what unique skill do you possess that might be the key to dismantling their system? Don't ever underestimate your own power. Sometimes the quietest person in the room can make the most noise. Thanks for listening.